Stereotypes. The National Italian-American Foundation hosted the event, which runs about 2 hours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As a reminder, I'm Joe Sorrell, the president of the National Italian-American Foundation. I'm actually here just to open up the program. We want to again thank all of our, it's been done at lunch, but in case we don't do it again this evening, the staff of this operation, from Donna DeSanctis, Alyssa Ruffino, Polly Stapleton, Rich Santoro. I know I'm forgetting a half a dozen people, for which I apologize, and we'll pick that up at the next opportunity. Now, this afternoon, you might have seen, for those of you who had the angle, you might have seen probably the most articulate denunciation that I've ever heard of this program called The Sopranos. Just my only personal side, a little quick comment, editorial comment. May I point out to you that if you have a question, and I know that Frank Guarini, our distinguished chairman, will be probably rolling over it, the microphone is in the dead middle. You cannot ask a question without talking to the microphone. Since this program is on, will be seen. NEAF will attempt to get the information to you. You can call in our 800 number. This information will be seen on C-SPAN, and C-SPAN is doing this right now, so I'm not giving them a plug, although we're most appreciative for all of the media coverage we have today. But if you have a question, please use the center microphone. If you have cell phones, you would give us the courtesy of turning off the cell phones, since we'll have difficulty again with our live television. I have no other role now except to turn this over to my distinguished predecessor as president of NEAF, our vice chairman, our chairman of Institutes Day, my dear friend Dr. Ken Shongley, and the rest is his. And again, to the panel, I could single out some of you, but I do want to say that you are in for a treat. I can assure you that today. Dr. Shongley.
Thank you, Joe. I am fortunate enough to be the moderator of this outstanding program, and let me just relax up here a little bit. As I told some people this morning, you know, my wife and I lead a small city country life in Burlington, Vermont, and I said coming to New York always makes me feel better. It gives me a chance to put a suit on. I told everyone that this morning, and I just wanted to say, you know, I told 2 of my neighbors that I was coming, and one of them turned to me, who had never been to New York, and said, you know, you better be careful in that city, because I heard that in the zoo, they actually have bars to protect the animals. To give you an example of how small it is, we're getting a little better. We're up to about a 5 out of a 10 on the meter scale. My other neighbor said, you know, New York City is amazing. Those skyscrapers are amazing, but I've never quite figured out how they work. I will not quit the day job. Welcome back this afternoon. This morning, this is Institutes Day, and this morning we spoke about Columbus, and we featured our Italian Language and Culture Institute. This afternoon we're featuring the Media Institute, which monitors how the media treats Italian Americans. And we are discussing the program, the HBO program called The Sopranos, which I'm sure all of you know, deals with a fictional Italian-American and his fictional, supposedly Italian-American family. Now, I can tell you that in my tenure at the NEAF, and I mean, I've been involved as a volunteer for more than a decade, I personally have stayed away from defamation. And I know many of you have not, but I just have felt that the security of knowing my culture and my family, that the positive stereotypes would overwhelm the negative stereotypes. But I think The Sopranos is a special case. I have come to the other side. It is now seen by 11 million people, and it is influencing America. And since there is nothing else about us on television, it is telling America what to think about us. Now, this is amazingly pervasive, and even last night, I was at a lovely dinner last night, and there was a woman there who was one of the most important literary agents in the United States. And so she was telling me that she loved The Sopranos, was very apologetic for that, but then said that she knew another literary agent who was Italian-American, who knew those people, who grew up with them in New Jersey. Now, I grew up in South Philadelphia, and I know that the idea has so pervaded our consciousness that we're actually deluded. I just know that other literary agent does not know The Sopranos because they're such a tiny percentage of our population. In a way, this is, I say, it's as tiny as Murder Incorporated was for the Jewish American, what I call the kosher nostra. There's no way that Murder Incorporated can be used to define Jewish people, and of course, the small group of people in organized crime cannot be used to define us. However, we cannot ignore it, and therefore NIAF has decided to create this panel. It's a panel of outstanding people, and you are in for a treat. Our format is simple. They will each come to this microphone and speak for a short time. We have a lot of people, 6 people, so I'll try to keep the program going so everyone gets a chance to speak. And then after that, there are some questions that have been prepared that I will ask the panel, and then after that, there'll be questions from the audience. So I will introduce the speakers one at a time, just to save a little bit of time. Now, our first speaker is Dr. Camille Paglia. For those of you that know her, know that she has an electric mentality. She is an extraordinary scholar and cultural critic, university professor and professor of the humanities and media studies at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, where she's taught since 1984. She earned her PhD from Yale and is a best-selling author of 4 books, including the widely respected Sexual Personae, Art and Decadence from Nefertiti to Emily Dickinson, which if you haven't seen it, buy it. It's just an amazing intellectual tour de force in which he takes a mega trend through history with several thousand micro trends, and when you read it, you'll know everything. Professor Paglia has been a columnist with the online magazine Salon since its inaugural issue in 1995. She's written innumerable articles on art, literature, popular culture, feminism, and politics. She's lectured, appeared on television and radio extensively in the United States and abroad. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Camille Paglia.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I just have to say that I too never took seriously the complaints of some Italian groups about the proliferation of mafia stereotypes in the media, because I am a great admirer of Mario Puzo's work and think that the first two Godfather films, 1972 and 1974, are masterpieces and in fact do represent a tremendous range of Italian-American personalities and mannerisms, and the dignity of the Italian-American man is well shown in those films, in the brilliant performances by Marlon Brando and Robert De Niro as the older and younger Godfather. I even had the pleasure of meeting Mario Puzo when I did a profile of him for the New York Times and made a pilgrimage to his house on Long Island. So it's not the mafia part of The Sopranos that I detest, but rather the way the show shows Italian Americans as vulgar buffoons who don't know how to eat, who are stupid and graceless. And this show so infuriated me when I first tried to watch it that I joined this organization, NIAF, as a protest, and I have become I've become absolutely militant on this question. I think Italian Americans need to go to war on this question. The culture that brought you the Italian Renaissance, the culture that has so many brilliant figures in the arts and sciences and intellect, goes all the way back to ancient Mediterranean culture with all of its complexity. The way The Sopranos has now become the sole point of information for a younger generation who has the worst possible education. Education has become a PC vacuum where on both the primary and secondary level, where the Western tradition and great art and literature have been removed. So what exactly are young people seeing but this hideous and vulgar show? Now, I have been teaching in Philadelphia now for 17 years. My university, the University of the Arts, is located on South Broad Street. I must go through South Philadelphia, which is like an Italian city unto itself, every day when I go to work. And I'm telling you from my observation of working class Italian life in Philadelphia, in southeastern Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, that The Sopranos is a piece of crap in terms of its in terms of its representation of ethnic life and also working class life. What disgusts me about that show, and disgusts me about David Chase, shame, vergogna to David Chase, vergogna, okay, for what he has done with this show, is his failure, his passivity in terms of accurate representation of the fascinating multi-class level of Pennsylvania and New Jersey life. There are all kinds of gradations, from the working class to upper working class to lower middle class to middle class to upper middle class and so on. This could have been a major show had David Chase taken the time to try to show the fullness of Italian-American culture and not just this now 30-year-old stereotype. People who say, oh, this is very accurate. Excuse me, David Chase left New Jersey 30 years ago. I don't think he saw things accurately even then, all right? But it's 30 years out of date, even at on the best possible level. If The Sopranos were, in fact, supposed to take place in a period 30 years ago, then I might say, okay, it's a kind of caricature of that period. But the whole thing is artistically a mishmash. As a professor of media studies, it is very low quality in terms of its observation of that area. I don't know why New Jersey hasn't brought suit against the show. The way New Jersey is being shown. Do you know people in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa are watching this show and thinking that's New Jersey? I fear they'll probably have to take a plane over New Jersey to get from Manhattan to Philadelphia if they ever visit here. But you know, I feel that it's the responsibility now of Italian Americans to speak out, especially those like my own family who in fact were not urban. Okay, we came from the small towns in Italy. My mother was born in Italy. All four of my grandparents were, and we are the product of the countryside. The countryside. We did not. My family. Came over en masse to work in the Endicott Johnson shoe factories in upstate New York. We're not part of metropolitan New York. I'm sick and tired of the way that media, of the way television and movies continue to focus in on particular sort of psychopathology of degenerate urban or metropolitan life and ignore the great masses of us out there, okay, who are products of the village, who have very strict ethics, very strong family life. Well, I can see this is going to turn into an absolute rant. I will take the entire audience prisoner. And we must allow the other panelists to speak, but those are my views.
Well, if it were not difficult enough to follow that, he has different views. I now introduce Bill Tonelli. Bill Tonelli is a fellow South Philadelphian. He is an editor at Rolling Stone. He has written magazine and newspaper articles about Italian-American life and is an author of a nonfiction book, The Amazing Story of the Tonelli Family in America, which I have read and enjoyed very much. He is currently compiling and editing an anthology of writing by Italian-Americans to be published next year by HarperCollins. I bring you Bill Tonelli.
You know, as Ken said, I had a slightly different view, but now after hearing Dr. Pai, I decided that really I was completely wrong about everything. And I've turned 180 degrees around, and thank you very much. You know, I was just thinking about a place where it's indisputable that people, when we talk about Italian Americans, really, we're talking about the descendants of Southern Italians. And I was thinking about a place where no one disputes that the image of Southern Italians is that the dirty, low-class, no-good, criminal gangster element. And that place is Northern Italy. And in Northern Italy, the view is held, I think, much more widely of the despicable, low-class nature of Southern Italians, much more widely held than here. Even, and I think that may be in part because the descendants of Southern Italians of 100 years ago there in Italy have done much less well for themselves than the descendants of Southern Italy have done in this country, in America. I mean, I understand. watch The Sopranos and like it. I like it because it's a TV show. I have no idea. I might like it if it were not about Italian Americans, which is a subject that does fascinate me, or if it were not about gangsters, which is another subject that does fascinate me, but I have no way of knowing. But every day I also pick up the newspaper, and not that I make a big study of this, but I see names like, I forget his name, of course, but the president of IBM, or the president of Microsoft, or the president of Eastman Kodak, or the director of the White House Office of Religious and Community-Based Initiatives, all of whom are Italian American, and all of whom have been chosen by the very state, I imagine, boards of big Fortune 500 companies, or in the case of John DiIulio, chosen for his job by George Bush, as far as I'm concerned, no particular friend of the working man or of Italian Americans, or about people who live the East Coast, or any of that. But he chose these guys, and all these various boards chose these guys. And I don't think that the board, for instance, of IBM says, you know, there's a chance that this guy is really a dirty, no good mafioso, but we think he'd make a good president anyway, we'll give him the job. And I think the same is true of Microsoft, and I don't think that George Bush looked at John DiIulio and said, well, he's probably a crook, he's Italian after all, but I'll put him in this very sensitive, important position. So I think that it's important to keep all this in mind, and I think it's important for people to focus on all this, as I was telling somebody earlier, and they thought that maybe this wouldn't be the most politic thing to say. We live in a world now where it's really difficult to say anything that remotely smacks of a stereotype. Positive stereotypes you get away with. Negative or even neutral stereotypes, it's very difficult to say anything about people. Unfortunately, lots of the stereotypes were the source of a great deal of humor and probably even good drama in years gone by. And gradually over the years, due to political correctness, we've lost the ability or the right to use any of those stereotypes. And so people come to me and say, well, you know what, if they said, I'm going to try to be politic about this, if they said what they say about the Italians and the Sopranos, if they said this about this other ethnic, religious, racial, sexual orientation group, that they would really be held to pay. And I said, well, you're absolutely right. I absolutely agree. You can say things, as they say, you can say things about Italians on HBO that you couldn't say about other groups. And you can see that as a negative, or you can see that as a positive in two ways. First of all, I think that you can say certain things about the Italians and it doesn't really hurt them. Unlike other groups, nobody's burning down Sons of Italy halls as a result of some hatred toward Italian Americans that's been engendered by the media. And I think the other point to make in that is that Italian Americans, as kind of one of the positive stereotypes, have typically not been crybabies. They've been stoics. That's part of, to me, what has made Italian culture something to be proud of. Italian American culture, definitely Southern Italian peasant culture, something to be proud of is that kind of stoicism and that kind of defiance that is not asking people to be nice to them. If people aren't going to be nice to you, then they're not going to be nice to you. And these people, at least as I remember growing up in a place like South Philly, completely surrounded by, you know, what we used to call, and not unkindly, greaseballs. Anybody who had come from Italy were the greaseballs, and then we were all their descendants. And we said this about our own family members. There's nothing negative about it. But Italian Americans weren't crybabies. And I sense sometimes now that in this, it's kind of like this victimization bandwagon that has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger every year. And I think that America loses something, or we lose something, if Italian Americans become crybabies. That's a silly point in a way. I realize that if people are being defamed, that I guess that, you know, look, if you think people are being defamed, I guess you have to, you know, make a fuss. But I think that this is also an important thing. I think that for a show like The Sopranos, not that I really want to, I feel like an unpaid apologist for bigotry and defamation here today. It's not that, I don't really care about The Sopranos. I like it, but I like what I like and everybody else likes what they like. But I think that the gangsters, whether it was from The Godfather on, have certain attributes that people do envy, whether it's certain freedom, whether it's a certain cavalier attitude toward the laws, or if not the laws, toward the rules. It's a certain family cohesiveness, it's a certain defiance in the face of unkind authority. These are all attributes that all the Italians, not just the gangsters, brought over from Italy. And I think that these are attributes that Italian Americans would be unwise to try to abandon in some desire to be seen the same way that all other Americans are seen. You know, I think an interesting thing happened in terms of these image of Italian Americans that nobody has really paid too much attention to. The Italians were the only one that I could see managed to accomplish this, which is that beginning in this, I guess, late 60s, Mario Puzo wrote The Godfather. Mario Puzo wrote The Godfather. He wrote a previous novel called The Fortunate Pilgrim. It was essentially a very beautiful, affecting novel that had his mother as its heroine. And his father died, and she held the family together. It was a very moving story, and clearly a love letter in a way to his mother. Books sold nothing, badly, very badly. And he had a family and a big gambling habit, and he had to earn some money. So he decided he would write a very commercial book, The Godfather. But he wrote in a new preface to Fortunate Pilgrim years later that every time Don Corleone opens his mouth, that his mother's voice comes out, that Mario Puzo's mother's voice comes out of Don Corleone's mouth, because he does somehow speak in the way that that all the Italian peasants who had to struggle and fight. Maybe he fought in a different way. Obviously, it's a fictional character, but it's the same cultural assets at work. From that point on, something interesting happened in that Italian Americans began to seize control of their own infamy. And so you had the books, The Godfather, and then the Godfather movies made by Francis Coppola and Mario Puzo. You had Martin Scorsese and Nicholas Pileggi and Gay Talese, all depicting Italian-American organized criminals. And interestingly, once the Italians began to depict them, the criminals became the heroes in a way. The criminals began to take on these heroic attributes. And all of a sudden, they were much smarter than the FBI, and much smarter than the senators, and much smarter than the U.S. attorneys. And they always won. They were always the cannier figures, the more complex figures. And so that unlike, as far as I know, any other group, the Italians came to own their infamy, and when they owned it, they shaped it. You know, we talk about, I don't know, there are various studies about the ill effects of Sopranos, Godfather, this and that. When I wrote my book, I came upon a study done by a sociologist who was trained at Harvard. Her name is Mary Waters. She wrote a book called Ethnic Options, in which she asked people of various ethnic groups which group they would be if they had a choice, and the number one choice was Italian American. So it seems to me, number one, that if Italians really come out so badly in all these various depictions, why would people feel that way? And my other thing, before I finish, is just to say that it seems that we have two possible options. One option is to say that Sopranos really is insulting and damaging and defaming. And the other is to say that you've got lots of Italian Americans who watch the show religiously, some of them famous, some of them have been quoted in the newspaper. Senator Robert Torricelli said that his staff is not allowed to schedule anything for Sunday nights because he has to watch The Sopranos. Here's a guy who's been around, he's been in and out of the corridors of power, he's a worldly person. It seems to me that if he and all the other Italian Americans who like Sopranos like a show that insults and damages and defames them, then maybe they really are, Italian Americans really are as stupid as some people say. But I don't think so.
Thank you, Bill. It is now a great pleasure to introduce James Wolcott. James Wolcott was born and raised in Maryland, where he attended Frostburg State College for 2 years before coming to New York, where he was hired, fired, and rehired at the Village Voice. At the Voice, he wrote a television column called Medium Cool. He covered the birth of punk rock and branched out into every corner of the pop culture. He's been a columnist for Esquire, Harper's, The New Yorker, and New York Magazine. He has contributed book reviews to The New Criterion, The New Republic, and the London Review of Books. He is currently a staff writer for Vanity Fair and is the author of a forthcoming novel, The Cat Sitters. James Wolcott.
I was telling Camille at lunch that my participation in this panel is in part an act of contrition because I wrote about The Sopranos for Vanity Fair. I did a column largely about HBO, but in it I praised The Sopranos. And and this often happens, you write about something and then you start either the show peaks or your perspective changes. But one of the things I want to discuss is my sort of increasing disenchantment with the show. But one of the things I want to talk about, since we are talking about the media and The Sopranos, is the media reaction to The Sopranos, and not just the media reaction, but the media reaction to the reaction, which is to say the reaction to the criticism of The Sopranos. Because you'll notice that when people want to stifle a discussion about something that's controversial now, they'll say, deal with it. Or if it's a historical thing, they'll say, get over it. Get over it. It was 50 years ago. What are you bringing it up now for? With The Sopranos, the thing that you often hear is, and you've probably all heard this, lighten up. Lighten up. It's just a TV show. Lighten up. The problem is that a lot of the same people telling you this are the same people who have told you that The Sopranos is one of the most profound, provocative studies of American life that's ever been on television. And I could cite a lot of sources, but I'll just stick with the New York Times. The New York Times began by saying that it was the most triumphant, I'm unsure about the word, but something like the most daring work of popular culture in 25 years. This was followed up by Karen James, I believe, who wrote that The Sopranos had the epic quality of Balzac and Zola and their multi-volume novels. And then, for me, the capper was this weekend when Frank Rich did a column about the producers and The Sopranos, and he was championing it as sort of like, well, this is a welcome, healthy backlash against political correctness. And one of the reasons I was just so staggered about that is, if anyone represents political correctness, and if any newspaper represents political correctness, it's the New York Times. I mean, so all of a sudden it's like, oh, no, it's healthy here. So what a lot of the people who are champions of The Sopranos are saying to you in effect is, it's okay to take it seriously if you like it. If you don't like it, you shouldn't be taking it seriously. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about was, I do think that Rich was right about one thing. There is a connection between The Sopranos and the producers, but I don't think it has anything to do with PC. I think it has to do with the fact that these are phenomena that have engendered an incredibly self-congratulatory audience. People pride themselves on being fans. There's a kind of glorying in it. And you feel somehow that they feel that this somehow makes them special. And in a weird way, New Yorkers have become sort of rubes. I mean, rubes in the sense of we've become these big boosters for ourselves. It used to be New York City never had to, and even though Sopranos is set in New Jersey, there's a huge sort of New York City identification with it. We never, New Yorkers never used to be the way. Now it's like, thumping our chest and look at us, Broadway's back. So this is part of this is one of the reasons why a lot of people that otherwise might not like The Sopranos feel like they have to see it because they have to be plugged in. It's what everybody's talking about on Monday morning. I'm sure many of you know there are radio shows, the call-in shows. They analyze the previous night's episode. On Slate, they have a team of psychiatrists that analyze the relationship between Tony and the doctor. And as I said to Camille, I said, if anything could discredit, psychoanalysis as a discipline, it's reading these people disgorge these Freudian cliches from 50 years ago. I want to talk about part of my disenchantment with the Sopranos as I continued watching it. Part of it is the self-congratulatory quality. And I think it feeds into the show, and I think the show reflects it. One of the things that often happens on television is if a show is successful, it stops being about what it started to be about, and it starts being about itself. Roseanne is a classic example. When Roseanne started, everybody said, wow, we've never seen such a great, accurate comedic study of lower middle class life. But by the end of the run, Roseanne was about Roseanne. They incorporated in jokes that had to do what was happening in the tabloids with her marriage. She worked in, the show became very, I hate to use the academic phrase, self-reflexive. This happened to The Sopranos almost immediately. And so I began to tire of this sense of like they're playing to us. They know how to, they know what their audience is and they know how to drop in certain references. Now, part of that is, and part of the appeal of the show is, keep in mind that The Sopranos does not appeal to a lower educated, low income audience. The HBO audience is an upscale audience. The people who read the Times clearly are an upscale. The Sopranos very, cleverly works in enough kind of highbrow literary references, cinematic references, so that those people can go, oh yeah, I get that. Mixed in with these kind of slapstick comedy of, a gangster dying on the toilet, or a hitman who's so fat that he can't run after someone. He takes 3 steps that he has to stop and, catch himself. So they weave that in very well. But that's one of the things I find tiring about it, is that sort of television, which is there is a sort of, the audience is patting itself on the back for liking it, and the show is patting itself on the back. The other thing, and this is really more important, see, I don't feel I should address the issue of Italian stereotypes because I'm not of Italian ancestry, and there's so many people here on the panel who can deal with that much better than I can. But I want to talk about the violence, because the other shift that I really felt in The Sopranos was it went from depicting violence and showing these people as violent to the point where I felt like they were getting off on it. They were getting off on Tony's power over people. They were getting off on the beatings. There seemed to be gratuitous beatings in each episode, as if to say, well, we got a lull here. We just had a domestic scene, so now we have to have Christopher come in and pistol whip some guy because he didn't serve his coffee fast enough. That began to creep into the show more and more. As many of you know, I don't know how many of you actually watch the show and how many of you are sort of boycotting it, but there was an episode that even disturbed the Sopranos fans where a stripper at the club, the Bada Bing Club, was physically beaten to death. I mean, she was just beaten to death. At that, it was meant to be horrifying, but it doesn't seem to have actually turned off the fans. When you talk to fans, sometimes they go, well, I wasn't really crazy about that, In this week, I didn't see this week's episode yet, but apparently this week, Tony puts a chokehold on his mistress and smacks her around. And this reminded me of something Camille wrote years ago when you were writing about Amy Fisher, and you talked about how people found Joey Buttafuoco sexy. That there was a certain appeal to it. You could see the dynamic between Amy Fisher and Joey Buttafuoco. And I remember very educated people, and certainly feminists going, they were appalled that who could find Joey Buttafuoco sexy? These same people find Tony Soprano sexy now. There is a huge sex appeal thing with Tony Soprano. And it's sort of like, so it's like if someone is like, so I guess they choose out who's dealing the violence, who you adopt as sort of your thug image. And so I found that the violence really became about itself. And I have to say that I don't think The Sopranos is alone in this. I really think that if someone seriously studied the trajectory of, say, Martin Scorsese's career, you would see that in the early films, the violence was a very different nature than the violence that came in the later films, which are much more flamboyant. I really believe that once Scorsese's got to Goodfellas and Casino, he was getting off on it. And I mean getting off on it in the sense of, these guys can do what I can't do. There's a certain wish fulfillment. Somebody bumps into me, I can't do anything about it. Somebody bumps into Tony Soprano, they get knocked off. And I do think that one of the things that's sort of absurd about the cult of The Sopranos and of Tony Soprano is it's a lot of people who, in every other aspect of their lives, pride themselves on being, considerate, humanistic, caring. But there's he embodies a wish fulfillment. Like, got to be great just to be able to sling your weight around and get away with it. And so this is why it's gotten to the point where I virtually cannot watch the show now. And I have to say, my wife, who's also a writer, she never wanted to watch The Sopranos. Her feeling was that she was sick of movies and TV programs that glorified hitmen, gangsters, serial killers. She felt like enough already. It's not enough that they kill people, but we're supposed to care about their existential crises. And what I am saying here is that I've basically have come around to her line of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wolcott. Our next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Messina. Dr. Messina is assistant professor of psychology at Fordham University and holds a doctorate in psychology from NYU. Among her current research projects is an exploration of the differences in Italian and Italian-American women's attitudes towards feminism. Articles of hers that focus on Italian-American women are included in Voices in Italian Americana, an academic journal, and books Italian-American History and Culture, an encyclopedia. She's a member of the International Division of the American Psychological Association, a past vice president of the American Italian Historical Association, and a co-founder of the Collective of Italian-American Women. Dr. Messina also maintains an active psychotherapy practice in Manhattan. Dr. Messina.
Well, psychologists have been studying prejudice and stereotype for approximately 50 years. So I thought it would be helpful to frame some of this discussion about stereotyping by grounding it in some scientific definitions of stereotyping and prejudice. So I'm just going to briefly give you some of those definitions, and then what I'd like to do is also briefly give an historical overview of the stereotyping of Italian Americans, which in my view has really not changed significantly in 100 years. The stereotyping that occurred in the print media in the first half of the century has just been recapitulated, recycled, and transformed by the electronic media in the second half of the century. Gordon Allport, who is the genius, really, the person who has written the main treatise on prejudice in 1954, noted in his groundbreaking treatise that prejudice or stereotypes, like the social categories they represent, are not inherently dangerous nor inherently demeaning. People's first thoughts and impressions start from categorization. Research indicates that people can categorize others within microseconds after first seeing them. In some of the very early studies of prejudice, social psychologists encountered a very startling phenomena in the laboratory. They found that when participants were assigned to one of two random groups, for example, after the flip of a coin, they displayed significant bias in favor of their group and against the other group. Thus, one of the very normal processes implicated in racism is the categorization of people into the in-group, us, and the out-group, them. This classification, in turn, indicates bias. Once categorized, people tend to automatically value others in their own group. And research repeatedly has shown that individuals tend to evaluate members of their, quote, in-group more positively and members of the out-group more negatively. However, social prejudice in general, and racial prejudice in particular, ensues from more significant conditions that experimenters cannot create in the laboratory. Prejudice alone does not determine racism. Everyone, after all, has prejudices, and all people tend to favor their own groups. But now theorists from several disciplines argue that power is central to racism. History and society confer power to certain groups, granting them excessive ability to exercise their prejudice. Thus, prejudice consists of negative attitudes against certain outgroups and their members that are often irrationally based. It is an antipathy toward outgroups accompanied by a faulty generalization or stereotype. Prejudice can be felt or expressed, and it is usually directed toward an entire outgroup and toward individuals as members of that outgroup. In essence, stereotyping is a simplistic generalization about a group of people that involves assigning them identical characteristics consistent with one's prejudice. While racism reflects the universal tendency to favor the in-group, societal variables transform these very basic processes into a very insidious phenomenon. The psychological basis of racism, in the view of psychologists, stems from asymmetrical power and racial prejudice. Members of social groups holding the most control over valued resources are prone to stereotype others and favor their own group members, particularly when they're motivated to maintain dominance, privilege, and status. In turn, members of lower power groups are vulnerable to subordination and exploitation by those who control resources. Individuals who control others and favor their own members, particularly when motivated to maintain dominance, privilege, and status, will control others. Stereotypes, in turn, maintain and augment hierarchy between social groups and are especially insidious when they're based on power differentials. So power in history makes some stereotypes worse than others. Representations of Italian Americans have strong negative connotations that reflect the history of this group in relation to Anglo-Americans and Northern Italians. These historically based negative stereotypes underlie the beliefs that hinder racial equality for us today. Now, just very briefly, I'm going to just give you a picture of some of the stereotypical images of Italians in the first quarter of the century. At that time, racism was contextualized in the idea that individuals who were from Northern and Western Europe were biologically superior to individuals who originated from Southern and Eastern Europe. And so from that perspective, Southern Italians were considered to be biologically and genetically inferior. As early as 1885, Italian immigrants were cast by the American press into stereotypical icons of the subhuman, racially inferior other. They were portrayed as ignorant, lazy, superstitious, dishonest, and bloodthirsty. One journalist remarked in 1885, quote, "By all odds, the most vicious, ignorant, and degraded of all the immigrants who come to our shores are Italian immigrants. A seething mass of humanity, so ignorant, so vicious, so depraved, that they hardly seem to belong to our species. Men and women, yet not living like animals, but like vermin." Historically, appearance has been the identifiable surface characteristic on which racial categorization has been made. Some of the earliest scientific studies of race relied exclusively on people's salient physical characteristics to draw lines between groups. Features such as hair complexion, bone structure, and hair texture became understood through the prism of racial essence as similar. Some features, but not others, were taken to signify race. American journalists cast Italian immigrants into similar racist idioms in which Italians were almost always described by the American press as swarthy and kinky-haired. According to Robert Orsi, an historian, the perceived features of these brown, olive-skinned newcomers did not easily adhere to the racial categories of black or white, at then the only two possible racial possibilities of domestic racial taxonomy. And in the view of historian John Higham, the genetic ambiguity in racial status of Italian Americans constituted what he said was the Italians' racial in-betweenness. That is, we were neither white nor black, we were brown. As Gordon Allport suggests, quote, "Dark skin implies more than pigmentation. It implies social inferiority. Far from merely contributing to appearance, surface features such as skin pigmentation point to unseen moral, intellectual, or psychological properties." Verdicchio posits that the whiteness of Italian Americans was erased in American society by a socially constructed ideology that excluded Italian Americans from this racial category and considered them to have been socially black. Soon after the arrival of masses of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, there was great concern in this country that most of these immigrants were of biological and intellectual inferiority. And in the context of the eugenicist movement, there was concern that among other things, the immigrants were propagating or creating children at higher rates than Native Americans, and there was concern that these immigrants and their children would vitiate the quality of our gene pool. Sorry, In essence, Italian immigrants and their children in the late 1900s and early 20s were tested by psychologists and found to be of inferior intelligence. At the time, they were described as imbeciles, retarded, and ineducable. Needless to say, this had a profound effect on Italian Americans in the educational school system. Stereotypes of Italian Americans, characterizing them as stupid, ignorant, criminals, etc., persisted through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then, as I said, in the last 3 decades, the electronic media has perpetuated these images. And by and large, as we know, the representations of Italian Americans are ones in which we're either criminals or we're individuals not to be taken too seriously. And in some sitcoms, we have individuals like in Welcome Back, Carter, Vinnie Barbarino is sort of the macho Italian who's failing out of school. What does this mean for us today? Well, there have been several surveys that are disturbing. One was conducted in 1988 by Lichter and Lichter of 1,217 randomly selected students in the Howard Beach section of Queens, and it revealed that the Italian television characters such as Carla Tortelli on Taxi and Louis De Palma on Taxi and Tony Maselli and Who's the Boss, they were rated as most typical of their real-life ethnic group, both by Italians and non-Italians. And African-American and Italian-American students were more likely to report that they identified with these ethnic television characters. Similarly, in 2000, NIAF conducted a nationwide poll of 1,264 adolescents, ranging in age from 13 to 18. 44% of the overall sample reported that Italian Americans were most likely to be portrayed in the movies or television as a crime boss. 30% of Italian American adolescents surveyed indicated that they were proud of this image and thought that their ethnic heritage was being accurately portrayed on television. My guess is that many of these adolescents, like most Italian Americans, psychologically speaking, reside in a cultural vacuum, lacking knowledge and accurate information about our Italian American history and culture. Alternative and more constructive role models are not easily accessible to them, in part because the history and culture of Italian America is excluded from the educational curriculum of mainstream America's school system. When the history of an ethnic group is absent from the curriculum, there is the implication that the entire group is unimportant, inconsequential, and powerless. Also, these stereotypes are widely endorsed by the American public. A few years ago, a survey indicated that 70% of Americans believed that most Italian Americans and their families had some kind of connection to the mafia. In 1970, a survey in California demonstrated that Italian American or candidates with Italian American surnames were at a great disadvantage. They had a 39% disadvantage in the polls. And as many of you may know, Andrew Cuomo recently commissioned a poll to assess the impact of The Sopranos on his image as an Italian-American candidate. So it's really been fully a century since we've arrived. And in essence, our story is still being very stereotypically told. Submerged in our success story is also a story of great oppression and discrimination and marginalization. And the ghosts of our ancestors' experiences in the United States, I think, haunt many of us today, and I think exert an invisible yet psychologically profound effect on our psyches. I think it is in our interest, both personally and politically, as Italian Americans, to bring into public scrutiny the invisible racism that was rationalized in the early part of the century and perpetuated by the media in the latter part of the century. I think in so doing, we might rebut the terms of the dehumanizing stereotypes that have sustained and illuminated it, and hopefully this scrutiny will illuminate the issues from both past and presents, that shape our identity. I think it's important to realize that silence does not rebut stereotypes. Italian Americans have more to lose than to gain from self-imposed censorship. And as a psychologist, I would say the fact that research has been used to justify discrimination is precisely why sound psychological empirical research about contemporary Italian American experience is needed today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Messina. Our next speaker is a longtime friend to the NIAF and to Italian American causes, Dr. Joseph Scelsa. Dr. Scelsa is Vice President for Institutional Development at Queens College, part of the City of New York. He's the author of several books and articles on ethnicity, pluralism, and education, and he teaches and lectures extensively in Italian American studies. In 1992, he successfully sued the City of New York for discrimination against Italian American students, faculty, and staff. This was a landmark case and the first time Italian Americans found redress in the courts for civil rights violations resulting from discrimination by a public university. Dr. Scelsa holds a doctorate in sociology and education from Columbia University and is a certified clinical mental health counselor. Joe?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to confine my remarks to the effect of The Sopranos. What Ken mentioned just a minute ago was the fact that I am now Vice President of Queens College, which you also heard during this speech, the introduction, that this wasn't always the case. There have been far too many Italian Americans in higher education. Part of the problem that Elizabeth described in terms of the fact that we do not have the curriculum that we need to have, the infusion into it, is the fact that we do not have the role models nor the educators at the highest levels of the academy. Those who write the books, give the speeches, give the grades, accept the students. That's been a problem for us traditionally, and it still exists today. You know, just last week, MSNBC put forth a question, not the one that we have today. The one today, of course, The Sopranos and other stereotypes, how harmful are they? MSNBC asked the question, does The Sopranos unfairly stereotype Italian Americans? Does The Sopranos unfairly stereotype Italian Americans? How dare they? How dare they ask that question of the American public? How dare they? I don't think there's a person, with one or two exceptions in this room, that would say that not only do they unfairly stereotype Italian Americans, but they're negatively stereotyped, and that it is totally unjust and unfitting. But this is the kind of society that we live in today, and the way the media deals with the issue, in which they phrase the question. We know that the Commission for Social Justice, sort of Sons of Italy in America, before NIAF did their study, as Elizabeth alluded to, in terms of the fact that Americans feel that Italian Americans are either involved with themselves or know someone else who was involved in organized crime. This was a little over a decade ago. 74% of the American population. We know that Bill Del Chiaro, who's in this audience also this morning, also said that 84% of all the media depictions of Italian Americans since Hollywood began depict Italian Americans in a negative way. Either it's bigots, bums, buffoons, and unfortunately now as bimbos as well. That's got to stop, because it has a devastating effect not only on Italian Americans, not only on our children, but on other Americans as well. What The Sopranos has done, it has trivialized us, and it has made us a victim not only amongst ourselves, but to American youth in general. Can you believe that in Columbine, Colorado, a group of non-Italian American youth chose to call themselves the Trench Coat Mafia? Why did they do that? They just picked that name out of the air? I'm sure there wasn't a mafia in their group, an Italian American organization. There probably wasn't even a Sons of Italy chapter or a NIAF chapter. No, they more than likely got that stereotype from the media, from the depictions that we've had since the early part of the 1900s in the motion picture industry. First, as part of the Black Hand in the silent films, then Enrico Bandello But Little Caesar, Edward G. Robinson in 1931, then the Godfather trilogy that we've seen, which some of us love because of the family parts in it, but definitely has victimized us, and now the atrocity of The Sopranos. Put it all together. What do you have? A continual bombardment on the American psyche that Italian Americans are a nefarious group that is dangerous, that you should not associate with. Almost 11 years ago to the day, Mrs. Matilda Raffo Cuomo, who was with us this morning, who was then the First Lady of the state of New York, took the very heroic stance to let everyone know that Italian-American youth in the public high schools in New York City had a problem. They had the third highest dropout rate in New York City, and that's a fact. In New York City. Now, I wouldn't say that it doesn't happen in other places, but I know it happens in New York City. And I know the reason why it happens because somebody by the name of Al Lubrano, who worked for the New York Post, said, "Joe, how could that be?" So he went to the streets of Bensonhurst, which had a 25 high school dropout rate percent, and he interviewed the students on the streets, those that weren't in the schools. And what did he find out? He found out that the curriculum, as we've talked about, doesn't talk about us. He found out that there are very few role models in the curriculum or in the school systems or in the larger society. And as a result of that, as any young person will do, rightly so, will look for some kind of power, glory, some kind of glitter and gold. And what did they find? They found figures to identify with, unfortunately, that the media puts forward and catches on to, like The Sopranos. Now, at that same time, a writer by the name of Betty Lou Ebron, who wrote at that time for the New York Daily News, was following up on the John Gotti story. And where does that play into this? It plays into this with terms like the Teflon Don, you know, with terminology like that these people are invincible. I mean, he's not doing too good right now. From what I understand, he unfortunately, I wouldn't wish this on anybody, he's dying of cancer in federal prison. It wasn't too Teflon in the long run. But unfortunately, I saw a generation of youth, Italian-American youth, and others, ruined by those images and those beliefs that it was possible to have a good lifestyle, to have a good standard of living, to have the big cars and all that goes along with it, instead of taking on the route to an education. And lowered their aspiration levels. And unfortunately, they did not go into the school systems in the numbers that they should. We've got around that to some extent because of the work of Mrs. Cuomo and also the work of Speaker of the City of New York, Peter Vallone, who inspired us to start a mentoring project, which we worked on with the NEAF, and we also worked on with Mentoring USA. And I think we've turned that around a little bit in New York City, but much more needs to be done. But the problem goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. And if you really want to know where the last bastion of this is today and how it affects you and your children and grandchildren in the audience, look at your Ivy Leagues. Ken Chungley, our vice chairman here, has spoken about that many times. Only 3% of the Ivy Leagues in this country, colleges, accept Italian-American students. Those are the very pillars, the keepers of the culture of the society. Those are the incubators, the places where the next generation of leaders comes from. Until you get into those bastions of power, you're nowhere. I think Ken once was quoted to me as saying that 50% of all of the Secretary of States of the United States came from one college. It wasn't Queens College, it wasn't City University. It was Harvard. And until we can make it into those hallowed halls in the large enough numbers, we're going to have a problem. This image keeps us out. It keeps us out of the Ivy League. It keeps us out of the academy in a very, very large way. You know, I'm hesitant in saying it, but I will say it. One of the latest victims of this is my son. He applied to several Ivy League schools. He went to a very prestigious private school in New York City. And I come from the Bronx myself. My parents provided me with a very wonderful education, and I was able, because of them and the inheritance that I have, to allow him to do that. He has extraordinarily good SAT scores. He was basically an A- student in his school. Yet he was not accepted in one Ivy League school. Not one. Am I angry? You bet I am. Now, since you've heard that I'm a vice president at a university, you know I know a little bit about the admissions process. And you know that it's not completely objective. It's a very subjective process. Just as the process for promotion, hiring, and tenure for faculty at the university, so is the admissions process. Very subjective. There are people who sit around tables who judge you by the vowel at the end of your name. Don't you ever forget that. And when you have shows like Tony Soprano in syndication all over the world, that persists to continue that there are negative stereotypes. And in the back of their minds, they say to themselves, is this person really smart enough? How did they get there? Why are they here? Oh, do we really want them around? Remember that. Two of our great leaders, Mario Cuomo and Geraldine Ferraro, suffered the slings during their political careers. And Mario, before he even got into politics, he graduated tops in his law school, St. John's, and did not get not one offer at one Wall Street white shoe firm. As a matter of fact, I remember him saying, and I was listening to Andrew this morning, but I remember his father saying at another time that, the dean of the law school said, well, Mario, maybe you ought to change your name. Unfortunately for us, he didn't do that, and he became one of the greatest governors we've ever had in the state of New York. Geraldine Ferraro, we know about Sam Donaldson and the Oprah Winfrey Show, and the fact that she was investigated more so than anybody else because he said on public television, nationally, that because she had a vowel at the end of the name and because she's Italian. Now, if you think that doesn't continue to go on, it goes on everywhere. In 1990, a very courageous group of, and I'll end up with this, a very courageous group of faculty members at the City University of New York decided that they had had enough. Because for other groups, and I will mention the group in particular, the Jewish people were very, very successful in coming in the 30s and 40s and 50s to the City University, and my hat's off to them. We felt that the Italian-American community could do the same thing. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. The first step to the more prestigious colleges in terms of the professoriate traditionally was the public colleges, and in that line. But from 1978 to 1990, the Italian-American faculty at the university did not even increase 0.1%. Finally, in 1990, the faculty filed a class action complaint, and in 1992, I went to federal court in front of Constance Baker Motley, an African-American jurist who worked with Thurgood Marshall, the framers of the civil rights movement, in the 1955, the Brown decision, and she found and gave me an injunction against the third largest public institution for higher education in the United States, the City University of New York, an injunction against the university from discriminating against Italian Americans in promotion, hiring, and tenure. She knew what she was talking about. She's seen it before. But we've got to do it again. And that's why I support organizations like AIDA, which you'll hear from shortly, and why I'm here today. And why I promise my son, and I promise all of you, I'll never be quiet. And I want you never to be quiet. Because together we will conquer this, but alone we will not. Thank you.
Our last formal speaker this afternoon is Theodore Grippo. Ted Grippo is chairman of the board and a senior partner of the law firm Grippo and Eldon of Chicago, Illinois. Last year, Ted helped found the American Italian Defense Association, AIDA, to educate the public on the contributions to American society by Italian Americans, and to oppose by lawful means all forms of negative stereotyping and defamation of Italian Americans. In April, Aida filed suit against Time Warner Entertainment Company, which produces The Sopranos. Aida charges that this television series violates the Illinois Individual Dignity Clause of the Illinois Constitution, which condemns communications that portray depravity and criminality and incite hatred or abuse toward a person or a group based on religious, racial affiliation. Aida's suit is believed to be the first of its kind in America, and it has attracted considerable media attention. Today, Ted Grippo will speak about this case and some problems that Italian Americans around the country are encountering when they attempt to hold Columbus Day celebrations in their cities. Ted Grippo.
I have a few preliminary remarks I'd like to make about Aida before I give you some of the details that Ken spoke about. First of all, I want to report to Camille that we are going to war and have gone to war. I'd like to tell you why I got involved in forming Aida as a preliminary comment. I owe that debt of gratitude to a woman by the name of Dorothy Rabinowitz. Dorothy Rabinowitz is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the Wall Street Journal. She wrote a moving and wonderful article about 1,000 Schindlers. Some of you may have read that article in the Wall Street Journal. If you haven't, I'd be happy to get it for you if you leave me your name and card and so on. She wrote that several years ago, and at the end of, and that article spoke about how the Italians had saved so many Italian Jews during the Second World War, how they put their lives on the line, and how Italian soldiers turned guns on Nazi soldiers to protect their Italian Jewish citizens. She also spoke that she was going to write a book about this. And I was interested in this subject, and I called her on the telephone. I reached her at the Wall Street Journal, and I asked her about the book, and she said she was working on it. She's very busy. She's got a lot of irons in the fire, a lot of things to do, and she hadn't gotten to it. But then she turned the conversation on me, and I told her I was with NIAF at the time, and I still am, and that I was working in the anti-defamation area, and she asked me what I was doing about that ridiculous show, The Sopranos. She asked me, she said, there is no other ethnic group that would put up with this. She jostled my conscience. And it was then that she put the seeds in my mind to do something about it. And a group of 4 lawyers, including myself, and 2 public relations people put Aida together back there about a year ago. And we have attracted 150 members. They're active people, and then we began the monitoring process of The Sopranos and other television productions. As you may know, The Sopranos is not alone out there. There's the advertising agencies that have all decided to piggyback on The Sopranos and prepare these hideous advertisements with gangsterism in it. Have you seen the Pepsi-Cola one? Have you seen Wrigley gum, chewing gum? Have you seen theirs? Lycos, AT&T. Then there's the, what is it, the Red Lobster. We're going to break some legs and so on. This whole process has taken on a life of its own. So that's why we got started with Aida. And it's been a continuing and deepening defamation. This started 70 or 80 years ago, as you've heard. And we've heard all about the gangster movies. And we saw the 1960s with the Untouchables. The 1970s with the Godfather trilogy, and then the Casino and the Goodfellas and so on, and we've come to the Sopranos and then these advertisements. So it's been an ongoing and developing process that has been laid upon us. So we decided to organize AIDA a year ago. And as I said, we've monitored what we've seen, and we've began to make our plans. And the process has taken us to filing this lawsuit. Now, what is this lawsuit about precisely? As you've heard, there is a Illinois constitutional provision known as the Individual Dignity Clause. No other state has it, but I urge you people out there that are in other states to think about this, either somehow or another. You can get to your legislatures and so on, and perhaps you can develop statutes or constitutional provisions that model after this, because you may be able to develop the same type of clauses, and you may be able to make use of them in the courts. So this constitutional provision provides that communications that depict criminality, depravity, and lack of virtue in any group by reason of or by reference to their ethnic, religious, or racial affiliations are condemned. Now, we're not asking for damages. We're not looking for money in this lawsuit, and we're not expecting to put the Sopranos off the air. We're not in the business of censorship, and we know we couldn't get it even if we wanted to. The First Amendment will protect them. What we are looking for is a declaratory judgment from the court to properly label this show for what it is, a violation of this constitutional provision. It's sort of like a truth in advertising kind of thing. They're running around with a $100 billion corporation that's spending millions and millions of dollars promoting this show, declaring it to be the greatest work of art on television in the last whatever. What we're asking for is a proper labeling of that show for what it is. It violates the Constitution. It gives us a certain balance, equality, a response to all of that, that's been going on in this for advertising this show. So I want you to know that. And why do we think The Sopranos is bad? Why do we think it's a vile show? Well, I'll tell you. It's on for its third year, projected perhaps to go on for 4 years. It's on every week. Then they have the replays after it over and over again. It's kind of an ethnic assault, as one person put it. It's an assault on an ethnic group. It goes on and on. Beyond that, it depicts all levels of life. It isn't just about the mafia characters themselves. It's about their families, their children, their mother, you know, the mother that puts out a contract on her son, the children with all their defects, and then it spreads to his sister who kills her husband point blank because she gets aggravated because he beats her up or whatever. And then it goes to the next door neighbor, Dr. Cusimano, who, you know, he knows what Tony is and he kind of puts up with it. And then, of course, we have the so-called moral center, who's supposed to be Dr. Melfi, and all she's doing is helping Tony feel good about himself. Help him feel good about the bad things that he does. That's her job. It's interesting that they would put that in there. Then we have the parish priest. Well, naturally, he's Italian, and he's got eyes on Tony's wife, and so he's not much of anything either, you know. And so that's the point. It goes beyond just the men. There's a big difference between this and the Godfather and so on. It's very different, very different. And so we see that all of these characters are defective, dysfunctional, and what have you. There isn't a decent one in the whole bunch when you get right down to it. So that's it. There's no balance. That's one of the. These are some of the defects. And what about the violence? And what about the treatment of women? After we filed our lawsuit, we had hundreds of phone calls and support of what we did. We had hundreds of emails, but one of the things that touched me the most was the calls from the women. They were bitterly disappointed with the treatment, especially that week that particular Sunday where they beat up that girl to death. It was horrible. I have never seen in television, the movies, any human being beaten so brutally before our eyes as I did in that. And any of you that saw that, would you agree with me? The beating, that if you saw that, it was violence and blood for the sake of it. There was no reason for it to go that far. And then the show is being glorified. And these people are being glorified. And even Tony said, in real life, character Tony said, that he's getting disgusted with it. I saw that just the other day, that he himself is getting disgusted with the show, and the fact that people have come to him and asked him to speak to their kindergarten and third grade classrooms. They're using him as a model, and they're doing it on the backs of Italian Americans. God forbid that we should be the ones to carry this message. Now that's why we brought the lawsuit. Win or lose, we will take it all the way. And this is just the beginning. We're going to model ourselves after the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League. There's an organization that started 80 years ago in Chicago with 3 Jewish lawyers. Today, they have a budget of $50 million, annual budget. They're in all the cities. When their heritage is attacked, they're there to challenge it. We want to try to do that. Now, that means we need help. And as they say, Italians have deep pockets, but short arms. And that's a stereotype. Now, I want you to know that all the major organizations have supported us, and we thank them for it. NIAF has publicly supported us, Sons of Italy and Emanuele Fano, and there are others, a number of others, and we're appreciative of that. And we will carry this on. And whether we succeed or not, ultimately in the courts, it's only the beginning, as I said. Now, as far as what Columbus Day, I think that we've seen a terrible, terrible breach of the civil rights of Italian Americans in Denver. It's not only in Denver, though. I found out in my own state, in Champaign, Illinois, the home of the University of Illinois, they're talking about doing away with Columbus Day. I say there's an interstate conspiracy. People are crossing state lines to foment this. We've got to get the best and the brightest of our sociologists, our psychologists, our lawyers. We've got to get them together here. And we've got to bring an end to this. My time is up. I'm happy to answer any questions, but thank you.
Well, thank you, all 6 of you. We actually finished on time, and it's amazing for 6 speakers, all so excellent. The way we'll do this now, we have about 15 minutes. I will ask one question. There were more sent here, but I'll just ask one, and then I'll open it up to you. I just want to take the chance to make a small editorial comment because I am the moderator. It is true that the Sopranos looks like us, they move like us, they sound like us, and they eat like us. But that's where it ends. Now, the woman last night that I was speaking to, the great literary editor, told me that the casting was so true, in her opinion, to the people that it supposedly portrays. And I just want to say to the national audience that what David Chase has done to the mother-son relationship, meaning Tony Soprano and his mother, is just an outrage. That character does not exist in our culture. I'm sure there are some. But America, we are blessed with mothers who give us unconditional love. That is our trademark. The mother-son bond is sociologically the tightest bond in our culture, and that the Livia character is an outrage, just an outrage. Let me tell you about the profanity as characteristic of Italian Americans. My father, God bless him, is 87 years old. I still have not heard the F word. I'm waiting. Now, Why is it liked so much? I heard Chris Matthews on Hardball say that he loves the program and that he's from Northeast Philadelphia and he recognizes those dysfunctional families from his childhood. Well, I say that maybe it was that way in Northeast Philadelphia, but it certainly wasn't that way in South Philadelphia. There may have been dysfunctional families, but they were a minority of people. So the point is that America likes it because it's about the American problems. It's not about the Italian part of it. Now, the question I have for Camille Paglia, as a student of TV, does the media, press and film media, malign Italian Americans? And if they do, which characters besides the Sopranos do you find particularly offensive? And if they do not, are there any characters about Italian Americans in the media that you find positive?
Well, let me just say that I think there's been a very unhappy pattern of actors trying to use Italian-American roles to win Oscars. There was a whole history of this for a long time. Movies I can't even watch. Prizzi's Honor, for example, I still cannot watch. The thing turns my stomach to see all the the stupid accent put on by Nicholson and Angelica Houston, whom I think is a wonderful actress, winning an Oscar for that. Totally inaccurate caricature. And then Moonstruck, okay, where you have Olympia Dukakis, who is Greek, getting an Oscar for pretending to be Italian when she's playing Jewish. This whole Jewish thing. The Hollywood film industry sees Jewish. They don't really see Italian accurately. And for me, one of the ironically most accurate portrayals of an Italian-American woman was by Mia Farrow, of all people, in Broadway Danny Rose, Woody Allen's film, that really is terribly inaccurate. I mean, it's mafia things later on, pure caricatures. But what Mia Farrow does with just a fierce-centered, smart, pushy, assertive Italian-American woman, I think is admirable. And as a friend of mine said yesterday, well, of course, she was married to Frank Sinatra. So I just think that the full range of Italian-American types has never yet been portrayed. There really is a kind of, again, a condescension in the portrayal of working-class types in general by the film industry, not in the 1930s when people were closer to the working-class roots, but we have a kind of a liberal bourgeoisie that runs the showbiz from LA. Many of them now are refugees from Ivy League schools, which are I guess, who would want to go there? These arenas of a kind of a desiccated WASP system. I think that is quite, it's quite past. And so I mean, I think that African Americans also have good reason to complain about the swamping of American culture by gangster motifs from the streets. I think that it was very parallel, actually. I think the kind of crisis of representation that is endured currently by African Americans and with the gangsta style of hip hop and Italian Americans. I think perhaps an alliance or a bridge could be made with groups in the African American community who are also concerned about the portrayals of African Americans.
Thank you, Camille. Now, I would ask you to come to the microphone in the middle and ask whatever question you have to one of the speakers. Manny Alfano, you have a question?
Hi, I'm Manny Alfano from the Anti-Bias Committee of Unico National and also the One Voice Committee. Before I ask the question, I'd just like to say we're here about the Sopranos, but actually the Soprano is the tip of the iceberg, all right? We have to look, because, we could all, or anybody could, take one show in isolation and defend it. But put the Sopranos in the big picture. Put them in with all the movies that have been made. Since The Godfathers, by the way, which I thought it was good, but guess what? It put us back 100 years. Unfortunately, it put it back 100 years. What I want to say is that we have show upon show upon show. Buffoons, bimbos, bigots, bums, all about Italian Americans. And I think that's the big picture, and I think that's what we have to go after. Not that we should let them off the hook, but that's the big picture. My thing is, this is for Mr. Bill Tonelli, and I have spoken, and I was going to ask you, Bill, but you have made a statement, and you wrote something recently, and you mentioned it here today about looking in the newspaper, and you saw many Italian names. And that's true. There are many Italian names in the newspaper, good Italians. The problem is, Bill, is that not too many people read the newspaper. But they will watch television, and they will watch the movies, all right? But in the entertainment industry, in movies and television, we don't see those good people. What we see is the lowlifes. And I think that's what has to be addressed. And I have asked you once before that maybe we should, as reporters and organizations, to look at the cause and effect. Maybe we should start to list these things. I don't know if I gave you a two-part question, but maybe you can answer.
Bill, you speak it.
I mean, I don't. What is the question? I'm sorry.
Well,
I don't mean to make it more difficult.
You had stated before.
A couple of weeks ago, I went through the Sunday New York Times.
Right.
Just I just happened to pick that day's paper, and there was over 100 Italian Americans. Whether there was the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, there were policemen, detectives, politicians, the whole long thing. A million opera singers. Right. Was a Sunday paper. There were 4 gangsters, and it was a legitimate news story. But I mean, 4 gangsters amid 100 Italian names.
Now, in entertainment, it's reverse.
Yeah.
And that's my question.
Yeah, yeah.
Is what? Oh, maybe it is. You know what? I mean, it's TV. I don't know who really. I mean, maybe some people get all their information, all their opinions formed for them by what they watch, whether they watch Cheers or I happen to like Louis De Palma personally, and I think that to discount him as an Italian American is a mistake. But I don't think that people really. I mean, I don't know what kind of people get their opinions formed by what they watch in sitcoms, but I don't think that these are the people who are going to be making the decisions that control America or the Ivy League or anything else today and tomorrow.
Well, that we could discuss.
I could be wrong, but that's why he asked me and I told him.
Okay, next, please. Thank you, Manny.
It could
no,
be.
you have to stand up.
These could be the ones.
C-SPAN. Are we on? I guess we are. C-SPAN. This is paradise. Great channel. Now, I'd like to. My first comment is about how good is the writing of The Sopranos. Yesterday, I saw.
Talk into the microphone.
Yesterday, I saw with my wife Raymond. The story was absolutely magnificent. It is a highly well-done show, and that's why it's so successful. Okay? Now, the reason I'm mentioning this, what the writers do is just beautiful. Okay? Just beautiful. You would not get this anyplace else. Ray Romano is a very clever comic. He probably contributes something, but basically whoever does the job or the group, marvelous. Now the connection is I have that same feeling about certain elements, not the boring parts, but certain scenes which I don't have time to even point out. I've done this when I stand up for a few seconds in my sound bites, the only chance I get, except here now on C-SPAN. Wow. Okay.
Sir, please.
I have that magnificent feeling. What writing, what understanding. And basically, I'll give you one little example. The scene where the Carmela is on the bed, and she says to Tony, you got to do one thing for me. You must, she did get it already. You've got to do the one thing for me. And she means that her children must get a chance for a good education. Now this, oh, what a scene that was. And there are many that hit me hard. I love literature, and this was it. Why? Because
Sir,
the reason I fell in love with it from the beginning, please.
In the interest
may
of
I
time,
finish?
could you please ask the question?
Yes, I'm going to speed it up. I loved the Sopranos from the beginning because I sensed something in that family relationship. Somebody said, what are the good things? What good people are there? The children are basically good, but the problem is that they're going to be influenced by the father, okay? The mother is a very fine person. Excuse me? Okay?
Sir.
No, I'm not talking about his mother. I'm talking about the wife.
Excuse me, just a minute, please.
Yes.
And just in the interest of time, there are people behind you,
yes,
and we have limited time.
All right.
Could you please show America that we can ask a short, concise question to one person? Thank you.
Well, here it goes.
All right.
Magnificent writing, so I'll stop right there on that. Now, this dialogue that we're having here is beautiful. There is one dialogue that is a good, important step, is answer the question that you have broached here. How is it? You have to explain why. No one has answered the whys. You all did a beautiful job. And that is with stereotyping and racism. Why? What? How's it conducted?
And who would you like to answer that question, sir? Who?
The future dialogues.
Mr. Wolcott, would you answer that question, please?
Oh, yes. Anyone up there?
Yes. You can't, you have to take the microphone.
I think, as I said, that one of the fundamental bases of racism is when stereotyping is perpetuated by those who control the resource, those who have power. Italian Americans have social and economic and educational power, but psychologically we remain a minority, remain psychologically marginalized. We are dismissed.
Next, thank you very much, Dr. Messina.
I have one question, but I'd first like to preface that question with two thank yous. One to NIAF. This was not a home run. This was a grand slam. It was great. And then I would liken the panel to buying a CD. You get a dozen songs, and there's only 2 of them that are worthwhile, and all the rest are less pleasing. Not so today. All of you were magnificent, and I enjoyed it. And I feel proud to be an Italian American to be here. But ironically, my biggest thank you has to go to James Wolcott, who's not an Italian American, who delivered the most cogent argument as to what's wrong with The Sopranos. I thank you for that. Now, my question, and I have to single out Mr. Tonelli for this question. You've heard I think some of the best people that we have in our community speak today. And I don't mean this as a contentious question. I would like a legitimate answer. Are these people crybabies?
All of them? I guess no. I don't think that these people are crybabies, but I think other people are crybabies.
Okay. Well, can you distinguish between? No, I think it's legitimate for you to answer this.
You want me to want me to say something bad about everybody else up here?
No, I do not.
For some purpose, but for why?
No, what I want you to say is why you find that these people are not crybabies.
I say crybabies because I thought it would make somebody laugh, or that it would make a point. I don't necessarily mean literally crybabies, but I think that there's a danger. I think I take a certain point of pride in being able to say, you know what, this may be perverse pride, and it's definitely not for everybody, but I take a certain point of pride in people saying, you know what, why is it that you can't say this about any other group, you could only say it about the Italians? You could see that as a bad thing, but you could also see that as a sign of strength. Maybe a weird sign of strength, but a sign of strength.
No, I disagree.
That could be. All right.
Thank you.
You could be right.
Thank you. We have time, I'm sorry, for just 2 more questions. Sir?
I had a comment, but I'll just ask a question.
Speak into the microphone, please.
I had a comment. I think I will make the comment. I think the best way to deal with the Sopranos is to laugh at the Sopranos, because the Sopranos does not represent anybody in this room, and by him saying it does, we treat it so seriously, and we cannot accept that stereotype as belonging to us. Now, the question is, to Dr. Shelster, would you agree? Anyone can answer this. Would you agree that the best way to combat anyone who wants to stereotype or malign Italian Americans is by helping Italian American artists, writers, and so forth to bring forth better images? Okay? Put your money in that area and help them to put things on the screen, in books, on the stage, and whatever, so that people can see the excellence that we have, and then not just put money into fighting a negative image.
Thank you. Joe, would you like to address that?
I'd like to introduce the speaker. It's Gene Ruffini. Gene, thank you for asking the question. You know my feelings on this already, I think. You know, basically is we don't have enough good scripts that are supported by the motion picture industry about positive role models for Italian Americans. You're a great writer, and I know it. And I wish they would produce some of the things that you've written and others out there. And I hope that they're listening at this point and they're getting the message. There are a lot of great stories out there that don't have nothing to do with violence, crime, sexuality, but are really about the family. And that's really what America loves. And I know that's what you write about. I hope they do it. I hope they do it soon, that they get the message and they get it really strong.
There are many like me.
Thank you, sir. This will be our last question, folks. I'm sorry.
I'll reserve any comment, but my last question is directed towards Mr. Grippo. I'm a lawyer. I read the complaint that Aida filed, and there is much to admire in it. I would only say that one of the great freedoms that we cherish in this country is a freedom from censorship by the government. Now, I know you've said that you're not asking for a restraint on showing of The Sopranos, and I admire that, but let me just suggest, and forgive me because you probably have researched this very thoroughly, labeling a program like labeling a book is a form of censorship. And I've looked into this a lot because back in the 80s, President Reagan labeled certain films from Canada that were about acid rain, political propaganda, and labeling The Sopranos, as much as we want to fight against it, as much as we want to criticize it in the private realm, to have the government involved in telling us what we can watch, what we can't watch, what's bad, what's good, is a real danger. It's a potential danger. It may seem like a small one compared to what the good fight we're trying to fight, but it is a danger that we run. Labeling is a form of censorship. I don't want the damn government, whether the judiciary or a legislature, telling me what I should watch or shouldn't watch. I don't think most of the people in this room want that either. But thank you.
Before you respond to that, Ted, let me just say that we've been given a 15-minute reprieve here, so don't go away, folks. Stay in line.
Let me briefly respond to that. I don't view that at all as an inhibition on our freedom of speech or any of that. The fact is, it's our method of protesting. It's our right to express our views. The fact is that this is not the same as government censorship in any way. We are the moving party. We are simply asking the court to tell us whether or not The Sopranos falls within the condemnation of that clause. And as long as that clause is still on the books, we're going to pursue it as our form and our method of free speech, to speak back to the $100 billion corporation, larger than many economies of other governments. The fact that they can have that kind of money, that kind of power, and that ability to control the channels of commerce and the channels of distribution of information, and we have no response. I think we do, and that is it. That's our method of protest.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
I'd just like to add something to what...
Ma'am, you're next. I want to get as many questions as I can as these people are saying.
I want to just make a legal point,
though.
In 1960s and 70s, when we had the race riots, there was the Werner Commission that was constituted to explore, among other things, the role in the media, or the purported role the media might have played in fomenting the riots, and the conclusion was that indeed the media had played a role. As a result of that commission, ethnic programming changed somewhat dramatically, and the portrayals of African Americans also changed along with it. And in the late 70s, Norman Lear, the great sitcom king, did a pilot that cost $700,000, and it was called Mr. Dugan, and it was about an African American, and he invited the NAACP and other African American coalitions in for a screening. They walked out in protest and said, this is just another reification of the dancing and shoveling slave, and it was never aired. So there are ways to involve government agencies and the judicial process that doesn't censor anyone, but sort of resets the thermometer in terms of what is considered ethnically and politically and morally reasonable.
Well, what you said Lear did, though, didn't involve the government. Private effort is great, and I think it's a great battle. And by the way, for positive images, Joe Shelser should be congratulated. The newly designed Queens College website has much of the program, The Italians of New York, in it, and it's a great educational experience, as it was a great exhibit. And Joe, the website address is what?
www.qc.edu//Calandra. Calandra. Thanks, Jim. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Madam?
Angela Forte. I'm from the Sons of Italy, the Mario Lanza Lodge. I'd like to address this to Mr. Grippo and Mr. Selchuk. The Sons of Italy and the Commission for Social Justice have gone all out against the Sopranos. Senator Maltese, our state senator, has now circulated petitions against the advertisers, against the network, and they're going to all the lodges in the state of New York and asking all the members to join up and go against the Sopranos. Thank you for your work, and continue it.
A brief response only that I have been in communication with Senator Maltese. We've talked to each other, we've written each other, and we're working together. I just want you to know that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you know also that, I've also spoken out against it with the senator on numerous occasions and recently in the printed media as well. I'd just like to make one final comment on it, in terms of legitimate speech. The Supreme Court of the United States of America has recently ruled, or at least has not ruled, but sent back to the lower circuit court in Louisiana, that in the case of natural-born killers, there's certain free speech that they might want to take a closer look at when society then emulates what they see on the motion picture screen. Basically, there's a message in here for The Sopranos and any other producers. You can be sued if what in essence you do in the screen ends up becoming what people do in reality, and that there is a connection between the two. Have to be very careful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir?
Thank you. Dr. Vincenzo Milioni, Director for Research and Education, Calandra Institute, Queens College. First I want to build on a comment that Dr. Shelsa said, how images are very, very subtle. That recently that there was a major multi-million-dollar scholarship fund established, the Anthony DeFrancis Scholarship Fund, which is administered through the National Italian American Foundation as well and assisted by the Calandra Italian American Institute. But this scholarship fund was left by a medical doctor here in New York that was the head of St. John's Hospital, left it to 3 schools, which are the elite schools: Caltech, MIT, the University of Arizona. And in this scholarship fund, it was set up for the natural sciences. That the fund is being administered through the National Italian American Foundation. The money's been already given to the universities, and we are waiting to get students. We just got a comment back, and Dr. Schultz is not even aware of this, that the schools are saying, because the will says that the scholarship fund is only valid to Italian-American students that have one parent, which is Italian. The schools are saying they cannot find students with that criteria and would want to change the criteria. That's the subtlety that goes on. Do they make the decisions in elite schools? Yes, they do. Do they make it at different levels? Yes, they do. And do they make it based on what we think are buffoons on television and the movies? Yes, they do. Here's a major situation. And one of those schools happens to have my son, who's at the University of Arizona, majoring in astronomy, working for the astronomy department, AP scholar, just invited to observe white dwarfs. There's an Italian-American student at that school, but they're saying they can't find any. That's why we got to change the image. That's my comment, but I have a question. And my question is not to the panel, because I probably know their answers. My question is to the audience. Everyone, please listen. Have ever in your life anyone said, is your family connected to the mafia? Or do you know anyone in the mafia? Raise your hand, please. Raise your hand. The cameras, take a look at that. That's what that survey was all about. And we all been confronted. And maybe even a handful of us, I won't even ask, have lost jobs because of that statement. That is the difference. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Christina Rizzo. I'm the current president of Italiana Unity at Queens College. My comment is for Bill Tonelli. When you said that you did not know who gets their, you didn't know who was influenced by TV shows. As a youth and as knowing Italian American youths and having family members that's Italian American, and this being a big discussion in our club, I know for a fact that a lot of third and fourth generation Italian Americans trying to rediscover their roots watch the show to get a sense of identity. So if we are doing it, other youths are doing it, other people are doing it. And I know for a fact that I was talking to, I'm not naming the club, another club, they were joking around and said, oh, we want you on our side. We wouldn't dare want to piss you off. And I know the implication of this. So if this, like I said, is influencing us, then of course it's influencing others. That's number one. Your other comment that you made about the guy that wrote The Godfather, his first book didn't sell, and then you said that he therefore resulted to The Godfather. There was a movie that we watched, very tear-jerking, very emotional movie called Vendetta. If that movie was given the publicity of The Sopranos, okay, it would be just as great, and that is a positive movie. It does not depict Italian Americans, Italians, in a negative light. That's my comment to you.
My name is John DeBaney. I'm the national president of the Commission for Social Justice, or the Sons of Italy in America. Thank you. First thing, I'd like to make a comment about the First Amendment. Everybody knows what the First Amendment is, but somehow the media seems to hide behind the First Amendment. When Italian Americans fight for their fair share in fighting discrimination, all of a sudden Italian Americans have to be apologetic, that they're fighting for what they believe. We don't have that problem with other ethnic groups. And we're happy about that as far as they're concerned. For example, you have the Seinfeld episode a few months back, or maybe a year back, when they had a problem with the Puerto Rican Day Parade. There was an apology from NBC. You had various programs that defame African Americans. African Americans have fought, and they've gotten them off television, or have had that kind of negative stereotyping reduced or eliminated. Recently, Bugs Bunny, there's a Bugs Bunny 25th anniversary celebration going on, and past clips of Bugs Bunny are being re-edited because they defame certain ethnic groups. Of course, not Italians. So the problem is that we talk about the First Amendment. I'm all in favor of the First Amendment, and I think everybody is. But it has to be shared equally across the board as far as ethnic groups are concerned. And Italian Americans have to be in that group. Now, my question is, why do Italian Americans, and I'll just leave this open to the panel, why do we have so much trouble getting our message across as opposed to other ethnic groups that have no problem eliminating stereotyping, negative stereotyping on television, and trying to reduce the perception of television as far as negative images are concerned?
Well, I could just give a theory. I believe that Italian culture is a no-whine zone. We're against whining. So whenever I'm in a grocery store and I hear some kid whining and carrying on, 2 registers down, I go, that's not Italian. Those aren't Italian people, and so on. I think Italians are have a sense of dignity in the public space, and don't want to appear to be like needy, okay, or demanding in the public space. They want to to preserve una bella figura. They want to have a sense of I don't know, a gravitas maybe in the old Roman sense. And so I know that stoicism of Italians is one of the great characteristics, and that there's a kind of dismissive what can I say, almost contempt I've heard from my Italian-American relatives about the constant kvetching and the complaining of all of the ethnic or racial special interest groups that are always clamoring in Washington for special treatment. So as a consequence, we've lost out in so many ways in the quota system that has emerged in colleges in terms of scholarship awarding, in terms of admission, so that all of a sudden Hispanics are regarded as a privileged minority, and you can have the situations I know about as a college teacher, not at my university but elsewhere, where a person could win a scholarship on the basis of being Hispanic or Latino when they have like one half Latin grandparent, and the student himself or herself has red hair. Meanwhile, I'm the child of an Italian immigrant mother, and all four of my grandparents were born in Italy. And the point is, how has this happened? Okay, except because of the love of America by Italian Americans, the desire to assimilate. How has this process happened that has led to the systematic embezzlement, okay, of Italian Americans and the way we've been eaten into by other more clamorous and less shame-based, I think, personalities. We're a shame culture in many ways, almost like the Japanese, rather than a guilt culture. So you don't want to make a spectacle, an unseemly spectacle of yourself, which is another reason why I despise The Sopranos, because there's a complete absence of that kind of a classical dignity in the portrayal of the Italian Americans. That's just my theory.
Just one other question. I just want to thank NIAF's Media Institute for taking a positive role and coming out of the closet, so to speak, and fighting discrimination. I think it's very important. And the best thing about The Sopranos is it brought all the Italian-American organizations together in a single cause.
Absolutely.
Can I just add something to that?
My name is Joseph Zuccaro, and I've been a member of Sons of Italy for the last 25 years. I'm a member of the Bella Italia Mia for the last 5 years. I'm a silver member of NIAF also, and I'm also an Italian immigrant of 50 years ago. I came here at the age of 27, okay? And I know my culture, my Italian culture very well, my Italian culture and history very well. And I'm very proud of it. And when I see for the last 50 years, the movies from Godfather to Godmother to Goodfellow, Bedfellows, okay? And now with The Soprano here, it's sickening, because it's been amplified, the mafia myth, for the last 50 years, and that's where the problem is. Many people don't understand the problem. It's been amplified, but our culture, which is the greatest in the world, you read history, Italy has contributed to civilization more than any other country in the world, okay, from the Roman to the Renaissance and so forth and so on, okay? But in fact, 60% of the art, of the world art, is in Italy. You probably heard that, okay? But all you hear and see over here in this country here, mafia, 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 and mafia. Enough is enough, okay? So I have one suggestion, one question. Is there any way to get, I'd like to read a column now and then on a newspaper like the New York Times or the New York News or even the Washington Post or whatever, there, a column, an Italian American will write a column about our culture, okay, to defend our culture and put down this Soprano business that goes on for longer and longer. I don't doubt it's a good show, it's a good movie, okay, I don't doubt about that. But it's too much of it, and that's enough of it. They should make some positive about Italian America, which we've had a lot of it. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Messina?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to what Camille just said, which I think was profoundly true in terms of the stoicism, la bella figura, and us being a shame-based culture. Also, though, it's important to look historically at our experience. Our experience, looking back, was extremely traumatic. Trauma is something we don't even realize is occurring when it happens. It's something we only recognize in retrospect. There was no possibility for us to speak up and protest our oppression and the discrimination that our ancestors experienced. In the early part of the century, those radicals, for example, who were engaged actively in very well-informed social protest, were expelled from the country. Beyond that, our grandparents wanted their children and grandchildren to be able to make it here, so they very wisely receded politically into the background and taught their children to speak English, et cetera, et cetera. I think psychologically we are at a very crucial point in our evolution as a ethnic culture in the United States, and that is that we now do have a real sense of self-confidence based on our very real achievements, despite all the odds that we encountered in our culture. And the nature of trauma is such that people don't begin to tell their story or even speak of their story until they feel psychologically safe. And in order to feel psychologically safe to tell one's story, one needs to have at least one or two empathic listeners who will not dismiss the story, who will not easily disregard it, who will take our story as seriously as they take the Hispanic story or the African American story.
I apologize to the four gentlemen standing there. We're essentially out of time, but will the last man please make a very quick question? And
yeah, just very quickly, I wanted to end on a positive note, and I'm George Altamari from the United Federation of Teachers and Italian American Labor Council, and we've tried, and some people have helped us, Joe Schelzer in particular, to have an Italian American curriculum throughout the schools to raise the positive issue and to raise a positive image of Italian Americans, and it's been somewhat successful. But I just want to ask you this. Do you believe that we made some progress since, actually roots, we owe that to the African Americans, of the early 70s to this time, and despite the setback of The Sopranos, is there any hope?
Who will take that?
Hope springs eternal, George.
I know.
Hope springs eternal. Do I believe we made any progress? I think Elizabeth very rightly put it that, you know, in terms of the developmental process in which a person becomes part of the larger society, we've taken that challenge and we've met it and we've done what needed to be done in order to wait in the mountains for our time to come down. And I say that because you know where it comes from, all right? But now is our time to come down from the mountains. Now is our time to claim our territory. Most of us are educated. We are at the same level or above the rest of the general population in the country, or above in many cases. It is now our time to come together as a community and to say, this is enough for all of us. If we've made it, George, it's been individually. It hasn't been collectively. Now's our time to do it collectively. Thank you.
Basta.
Ladies and gentlemen, I now would ask you to express your appreciation to this wonderful panel and show America how we feel about it. Oh, please fill out your questionnaires. Your questionnaires, please fill them out. Thank you.
You lost it. You're going to do it again.
Oh, thank you. You know, I wrote notes.
American Perspectives continues in a few moments with former Virginia Governor Douglas Wilder. The grandson of slaves speaks at a...
In the Endicott Johnson shoe factories in upstate New York, we're not part of metropolitan New York. I'm sick and tired of the way that media, of the way television and movies continue to focus in on particular sort of psychopathology of degenerate urban or metropolitan life and ignore the great masses of us out there, okay, who are products of the village, who have very strict ethics, very strong family life. Well, I can see this is going to turn into an absolute rant. I will take the entire audience prisoner. And we must allow the other panelists to speak, but those are my views.
Well, if it were not difficult enough to follow that, he has different views. I now introduce Bill Tonelli. Bill Tonelli is a fellow South Philadelphian. He is an editor at Rolling Stone. He has written magazine and newspaper articles about Italian-American life and is an author of a non-fiction book, The Amazing Story of the Tonelli Family in America, which I have read and enjoyed very much. He is currently compiling and editing an anthology of writing by Italian-Americans to be published next year by HarperCollins. I bring you Bill Tonelli.
You know, as Ken said, I had a slightly different view, but now after hearing Dr. Pai, I decided that really I was completely wrong about everything, and I've turned 180 degrees around, and thank you very much. You know, I was just thinking about a place where it's indisputable that people, when we talk about Italian Americans, really we're talking about the descendants of Southern Italians. And I was thinking about a place where no one disputes that the image of Southern Italians is that the dirty, low-class, no-good, criminal gangster element. And that place is Northern Italy. And in Northern Italy, the view is held, I think, much more widely of the despicable, low-class nature of Southern Italians, much more widely held than here, even. And I think that may be in part because the descendants of Southern Italians of 100 years ago there in Italy have done much less well for themselves than the descendants of Southern Italy have done in this country, in America. I mean, I understand. I watch The Sopranos and like it. I like it because it's a TV show. I have no idea. I might like it if it were not about Italian Americans, which is a subject that does fascinate me, or if it were not about gangsters, which is another subject that does fascinate me, but I have no way of knowing. But every day I also pick up the newspaper, and not that I make a big study of this, but I see names like, I forget his name, of course, but the president of IBM, or the president of Microsoft, or the president of Eastman Kodak, or the director of the White House Office of Religious and Community-Based Initiatives, all of whom are Italian-American, and all of whom have been chosen by the very state, I imagine, boards of big Fortune 500 companies, or in the case of John DiIulio, chosen for his job by George Bush, as far as I'm concerned, no particular friend of the working man or of Italian Americans or about people who live at the East Coast or any of that. But he chose these guys, and all these various boards chose these guys. And
performances by Marlon Brando and Robert De Niro as the older and younger Godfather. I even had the pleasure of meeting Mario Puzo when I did a profile of him for the New York Times and made a pilgrimage to his house on Long Island. So it's not the mafia part of The Sopranos that I detest, but rather the way the show shows Italian Americans as vulgar, buffoons who don't know how to eat, who are stupid and graceless. And this show so infuriated me when I first tried to watch it that I joined this organization as a protest, and I have become I've become absolutely militant on this question. I think Italian Americans need to go to war on this question. The culture that brought you the Italian Renaissance, the culture that has so many brilliant figures in the arts and sciences and intellect, goes all the way back to ancient Mediterranean culture with all of its complexity. The way The Sopranos has now become the sole point of information for a younger generation who has the worst possible education. Education has become a PC vacuum where on both the primary and secondary level, where the Western tradition and great art and literature have been removed. So what exactly are young people seeing but this hideous and vulgar show? Now, I have been teaching in Philadelphia now for 17 years. My university, the University of the Arts, is located on South Broad Street. I must go through South Philadelphia, which is like an Italian city unto itself, every day when I go to work. And I'm telling you from my observation of working class Italian life in Philadelphia, in southeastern Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, that The Sopranos is a piece of crap in terms of its representation of ethnic life and also working class life. What disgusts me about that show, and disgusts me about David Chase, shame, vergogna to David Chase, vergogna, okay, for what he has done with this show, is his failure, his passivity in terms of accurate representation of the fascinating multi-class level of Pennsylvania and New Jersey life. There are all kinds of gradations, from the working class to upper working class to lower middle class to middle class to upper middle class and so on. This could have been a major, major show had David Chase taken the time to try to show the fullness of Italian-American culture and not just this now 30-year-old stereotype. People who say, oh, this is very accurate. Excuse me, David Chase left New Jersey 30 years ago. I don't think he saw things accurately even then, all right? But it's 30 years out of date, even at on the best possible level. If The Sopranos were, in fact, supposed to take place in a period 30 years ago, then I might say, okay, it's a kind of caricature of that period. But the whole thing is artistically a mishmash. As a professor of media studies, it is very low quality in terms of its observation of that area. I don't know why New Jersey hasn't brought suit against the show. The way New Jersey is being shown. Do you know people in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa are watching this show and thinking that's New Jersey? I fear they'll probably have to take a plane over New Jersey to get from Manhattan to Philadelphia if they ever visit here. But you know, I feel that it's the responsibility now of Italian Americans to speak out, especially those like my own family who in fact were not urban. Okay, we came from the small towns in Italy. My mother was born in Italy. All four of my grandparents were, and we are the product of the countryside. The countryside. We did not. My family. Came over en masse to work.
And I know many of you have not, but I just have felt that the security of knowing my culture and my family, that the positive stereotypes would overwhelm the negative stereotypes. But I think The Sopranos is a special case. I have come to the other side. It is now seen by 11 million people. And it is influencing America. And since there is nothing else about us on television, it is telling America what to think about us. Now, this is amazingly pervasive, and even last night, I was at a lovely dinner last night, and there was a woman there who was one of the most important literary agents in the United States. And so she was telling me that she loved The Sopranos. I was very apologetic for that, but then said that she knew another literary agent who was Italian-American, who knew those people, who grew up with them in New Jersey. Now, I grew up in South Philadelphia, and I know that the idea has so pervaded our consciousness that we're actually deluded. I mean, I just know that other literary agent does not know The Sopranos because they're such a tiny percentage of our population. In a way, this is, I say, it's as tiny as Murder Incorporated was for the Jewish American, what I call the kosher Nostra. You know, there's no way that Murder Incorporated can be used to define Jewish people, and of course, the small group of people in organized crime cannot be used to define us. However, we cannot ignore it, and therefore NIAF has decided to create this panel. It's a panel of outstanding people, and you are in for a treat. Our format is simple. They will each come to this microphone and speak for a short time. We have a lot of people, 6 people, so I'll try to keep the program going so everyone gets a chance to speak. And then after that, there are some questions that have been prepared that I will ask the panel, and then after that, there'll be questions from the audience. So I will introduce the speakers one at a time, just to save a little bit of time. Now, our first speaker is Dr. Camille Paglia. For those of you that know her, know that she has an electric mentality. She is an extraordinary scholar and cultural critic, university professor and professor of the humanities and media studies at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, where she's taught since 1984. She earned her PhD from Yale and is a best-selling author of 4 books, including the widely respected Sexual Personae, Art and Decadence from Nefertiti to Emily Dickinson, which if you haven't seen it, buy it. It's just an amazing intellectual tour de force in which he takes a mega trend through history with several thousand micro trends, and when you read it, you'll know everything. Professor Paglia has been a columnist with the online magazine Salon since its inaugural issue in 1995. She's written innumerable articles on art, literature, popular culture, feminism, and politics. She's lectured, appeared on television and radio extensively in the United States and abroad. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Camille Paglia.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I just have to say that I too never took seriously the complaints of some Italian groups about the proliferation of mafia stereotypes in the media, because I am a great admirer of Mario Puzo's work and think that the first two Godfather films, 1972 and 1974, are masterpieces and in fact do represent a tremendous range of Italian-American personalities and mannerisms, and the dignity of the Italian-American man is well shown in those films, in the brilliant.
The National Italian-American Foundation hosted the event, which runs about 2 hours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As a reminder, I'm Joe Sorrell, the president of the National Italian-American Foundation. I'm actually here just to open up the program. We want to again thank all of it's been done at lunch, but in case we don't do it again this evening, the staff of this operation, from Donna DeSanctis, Alyssa Ruffino, Polly Stapleton, Rich Santoro. I know I'm forgetting a half a dozen people, for which I apologize, and we'll pick that up at the next opportunity. Now, this afternoon, you might have seen, for those of you who had the angle, you might have seen probably the most articulate denunciation that I've ever heard of this program called The Sopranos. Just my only personal side, a little quick comment, editorial comment. May I point out to you that if you have a question, and I know that Frank Guarini, our distinguished chairman, will be probably rolling over it, the microphone is in the dead middle. You cannot ask a question without talking to the microphone. Since this program is on, will be seen. NIAF will attempt to get the information to you. You can call in our 800 number. This information will be seen on C-SPAN, and C-SPAN is doing this right now, so I'm not giving them a plug, although we're most appreciative for all of the media coverage we have today. But if you have a question, please use the center microphone. If you have cell phones, you would give us the courtesy of turning off the cell phones, since we'll have difficulty again with our live television. I have no other role now except to turn this over to my distinguished predecessor as president of NIAF, our vice chairman, our chairman of Institutes Day, my dear friend Dr. Ken Ciongoli, and the rest is his. And again, to the panel, I could single out some of you, but I do want to say that you are in for a treat. I can assure you that today. Dr. Ciongoli.
Thank you, Joe. I am fortunate enough to be the moderator of this outstanding program, and let me just relax up here a little bit. As I told some people this morning, you know, my wife and I lead a small city country life in Burlington, Vermont, and I said coming to New York always makes me feel better. It gives me a chance to put a suit on. I told everyone that this morning, and I just wanted to say, you know, I told 2 of my neighbors that I was coming, and one of them turned to me, who had never been to New York, and said, you know, you better be careful in that city, because I heard that in the zoo, they actually have bars to protect the animals. To give you an example of how small it is, we're getting a little better. We're up to about a 5 out of a 10 on the meter scale. My other neighbor said, you know, New York City is amazing. Those skyscrapers are amazing, but I've never quite figured out how they work. I will not quit the day job. Welcome back this afternoon. This morning, this is Institutes Day, and this morning we spoke about Columbus, and we featured our Italian Language and Culture Institute. This afternoon we're featuring the Media Institute, which monitors how the media treats Italian Americans. And we are discussing the program, the HBO program called The Sopranos, which I'm sure all of you know, deals with a fictional Italian American and his fictional, supposedly Italian American family. Now, I can tell you that in my tenure at the NEAF, and I mean, I've been involved as a volunteer for more than a decade, I personally have stayed away from defamation.
I don't think that the board, for instance, of IBM says, you know, there's a chance that this guy is really a dirty, no-good mafioso, but we think he'd make a good president anyway, we'll give him the job. And I think the same is true of Microsoft, and I don't think that George Bush looked at John DiIulio and said, well, he's probably a crook, he's Italian after all, but I'll put him in this very sensitive, important position. So I think that it's important to keep all this in mind, and I think it's important for people to focus on all this. As I was telling somebody earlier, and they thought that maybe this wouldn't be the most politic thing to say. We live in a world now where it's really difficult to say anything that remotely smacks of a stereotype. Positive stereotypes you get away with. Negative or even neutral stereotypes, it's very difficult to say anything about people. Unfortunately, lots of the stereotypes were the source of a great deal of humor and probably even good drama in years gone by. And gradually over the years, due to political correctness, we've lost the ability or the right to use any of those stereotypes. And so people come to me and say, well, you know what, if they said, I'm going to try to be politic about this. They said what they say about the Italians and the Sopranos. If they said this about this other ethnic, religious, racial, sexual orientation group, that they would really be held to pay. And I said, well, you're absolutely right. I absolutely agree. You can say things, as they say, you can say things about Italians on HBO that you couldn't say about other groups. And you can see that as a negative, or you can see that as a positive in two ways. First of all, I think that you can say certain things about the Italians and it doesn't really hurt them. Unlike other groups, nobody's burning down Sons of Italy halls as a result of some hatred toward Italian Americans that's been engendered by the media. And I think the other point to make in that is that Italian Americans, as kind of one of the positive stereotypes, have typically not been crybabies. They've been stoics. That's part of, to me, what has made Italian culture something to be proud of. Italian American culture, definitely Southern Italian peasant culture, something to be proud of is that kind of stoicism and that kind of defiance that is not asking people to be nice to them. If people aren't going to be nice to you, then they're not going to be nice to you. And these people, at least as I remember growing up in a place like South Philly, completely surrounded by, you know, what we used to call, and not unkindly, greaseballs. Anybody who had come from Italy were the greaseballs, and then we were all their descendants. And we said this about our own family members. There's nothing negative about it. But Italian Americans weren't crybabies. And I sense sometimes now that in this, it's kind of like this victimization bandwagon that has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger every year. And I think that America loses something, or we lose something, if Italian Americans become crybabies. That's a silly point in a way. I realize that if people are being defamed, that I guess that, you know, look, if you think people are being defamed, I guess you have to, you know, make a fuss. But I think that this is also an important thing. I think that for a show like The Sopranos, not that I really want to, I feel like an unpaid apologist for bigotry and defamation here today. It's not that, I don't really care about The Sopranos. I like it, but I like what I like and everybody else likes what they like. But I think that the gangsters, whether it was from The Godfather on, have certain attributes that people do envy, whether it's certain freedom, whether it's a certain cavalier attitude toward the laws, or if not the laws, toward the rules. It's a certain family cohesiveness, it's a certain defiance in the face of unkind authority. These are all attributes that all the Italians, not just the gangsters, brought over from Italy. And I think that these are attributes that Italian Americans would be unwise to try to abandon in some desire to be seen the same way that all other Americans are seen. You know, I think an interesting thing happened in terms of these